Oh, sorry. Okay, I thought you were gonna. Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks so much. My name is Stefan Pongas. I'm an analyst with the Deloitte Group, a market research firm focusing on telecom, data center, enterprise networks. I joined back in 2010 and spent a lot of time on RAN and mobile infrastructure, and of course, Open RAN and private wireless are hot topics in the area. And today we're going to discuss the intersection of those two areas. And we're fortunate enough to be joined by not by one expert, but by four experts here from Mavenir, Viavi, Bosch, and Trilogy. So with that, I'm going to hand over to the panelists and introduce themselves. Who wants to start?
I can go first. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. My name is Venki Swaminathan. I'm a co-founder and CTO at Trilogy Networks. We're building a rural distributed cloud network for enabling and accelerating digital transformation for agriculture and energy industries. We are focused on getting the cloud computing capability to the very edge of the network so we can accelerate 5G deployments and automation of farming operations.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
So my name is Per Kangruk. I work with Viavi. I'm in the strategy office, so straddling one leg in the CTO office and one leg in the strategy domain. And we're in Viavi really here to make sure that all of the things in the world of and realms of telecom, being it Open RAN, being it any of the legacy RAN, etc., or any of the other parts of the network or enterprise networks, can operate in a good way, can be deployed in a good way, and can obviously be built and validated in a good way. So putting all of that together, so the enterprise world and the telco world, then you start to see the private networks, and we try to make that a reality by working with the various parts of the infrastructure vendors and the hyperscalers, etc., to make sure that people can stitch together what they want to do. But we're not the one operating the networks. We're not the one sort of selling the networks, etc. But we make sure that people are able to execute when they need to through test and measurement or service assurance, etc. across the board.
Great, thanks, Per.
Perfect. I can go next. My name is Vinay Dar, and I'm part of Mavenir, responsible for business development and partner alliances for private network. In a business unit we call emerging businesses. Our focus is to really bring in a more end-to-end cloud native software driven approach of building up an end-to-end private network solutions catering to the enterprise customers. And the approach is basically based on really bringing in what enterprises use to really, in the IT side, of really driving an open ecosystem and an open way of building a telecom network. So very happy to be on this panel discussion.
Great.
So I can conclude. Hello, everyone. My name is Andreas. I'm with Bosch. So we are one of the mentioned enterprises. Bosch is a major player in different vertical industries, including industrial, the mobility sector, but also in building automation and so on. And we have done a lot of work already on private networks in general. So we started looking into this already a couple of years ago. Also, we have been running quite a number of trials in different plants, for example, worldwide. As we speak, we have about 15 ongoing POCs all over the world. And recently we got more and more interested and excited also in Open RAN, because we see especially the combination of Open RAN with private 5G has a lot of potential, especially for the enterprise domain, of course. But as usual in life, there are also still a number of challenges ahead of us. So that's why we are currently in the phase of exploring and trying to understand and to learn what it can do for us and maybe where the limitations are.
Great. Thanks for that. I think with that, we can move into the discussion. I was hoping that we would start out discussing a little bit general, general where we are in terms of private wireless, and then we can move into why Open RAN is supposed to actually help this movement towards private wireless. And then if we have time, we can discuss a little bit about the Open RAN enterprise status there and how to deploy Open RAN. And then, of course, if we have more time, we can touch on the ecosystem and some of the risks. But I thought maybe we'll start with just to make sure we're all on the same land, so to speak, in terms of where we are in general with private wireless. And I'm not talking specifically here about Open RAN private, but just any type of proprietary RAN is fine as well, or proprietary private wireless, you're saying. And I can start since we have, I'll just add 1 or 2 data points here, but we have tracked the RAN market in general since the year 2000. And private wireless is actually not, from our perspective, not a new concept. It has been around since that time period. We started with GSM Picos back then and 3G Picos, but if you look at I guess if you look at the various hype cycles, I guess you could say that the narrative has kind of changed throughout the years. When I joined back in 2010, I remember fielding a lot of emails about private LTE enterprise deployments, because it was supposed to play a very important role as the inner site distances were shrinking with the higher operating frequencies, etc. And then, of course, we learned that private wireless did not accelerate perhaps as much as some had anticipated. So that kind of the interest waned for a little bit. But then with 3GPP release 15, that combined with more spectrum, local spectrum becoming available, particularly CBRS in the US and more local in Germany and elsewhere. I think that formed the basis for the interest picking up again. And now, of course, it's a very hot topic in terms of the revenues that we see when we measure private wireless. And I don't want to sidetrack this conversation by going into definitions too much here, but including large area macro networks that support public safety, transportation, and utilities, plus the local on-site deployments. Our estimates suggest it's still roughly 1 to 3% of the overall RAN market, so to speak, with the majority of that is driven by the larger macro network. If we zoom in on the so-called small cells, the private small cells, if we look at, say, relative to the total 5G public plus private RAN, our estimate suggests it's still less than 1%. So it's small from a commercial perspective, but I would also say that we do see decent traction with both LTE and private 5G and with several thousand commercial, I would say, 5G projects around the globe now. And there's tangible number of cases where enterprises can demonstrate efficiency and cost savings with private 5G. So it is real, but of course, at the same time, there are hundreds of millions of enterprises around the globe, and we're talking thousands of use cases. I would say we are, from our perspective, we have not crossed that chasm or the inflection point. We're still in the early adopter, early majority phase. And I'm hoping today we're going to discuss more, of course, on how to cross that chasm. So with that, I'm of course aware that I look at more the numbers. I don't have my feet on the ground like you do. So let's hear from the panelists here in terms of where we, just in general, where we are with private LTE and private 5G. If there's anyone who want to start, go ahead.
I mean, I can just summarize. Oh, sorry, Andreas. If I just summarize a bit on how we see sort of traveling around the world. I mean, we see a paradigm shift of private networks, as you rightly said, that private networks has been there for a long time, but we see a paradigm shift from it being a monolithic wide area network addressing specific use cases such as security or public safety, moving from there to basically much driven by the digitalization of the enterprises, which is only accelerating. We see a greater interest from countries all over the world to drive 5G ecosystem by actually democratization of spectrum, where you can actually provide spectrum at reasonable or even zero cost to the enterprises to set up their own wireless networks. We've also seen that the IT technology has evolved over the last 15 years in terms of distributed computing and cloud native architecture, and 5G at its heart in terms of architecture defined does support distributed architecture and cloud computing concepts, which then of course makes it really much interesting for the entire ecosystem to participate. Going forward next 20 years, we believe there's going to be a collective sort of push in terms of ecosystem players like device companies, application companies, network solution provider companies like us, system integrators, technology integrators, the industrial players such as we have here, Andreas from Bosch. I think we'll see a collective sort of really push from the ecosystem to really drive the innovation and the investment to cater to what I believe is going to be next 10 years a more sort of distributed networks, models, small and large networks, use case specific networks. For instance, manufacturing has been one area that we've been focused a lot on. For a very high value, high volume, goods based manufacturing company, even a decimal percentage productivity gain means $1 million of money saved. So they are really looking at private networks, especially when you go into release 16, 17 on 5G, to really have the time deterministic features that will really drive the ambition of the vision of the manufacturing companies to be a cable-free, to create a cable-free environment on a factory floor. So it's a very interesting phase, as I said. We're in a paradigm shift, and next 10, 20 is going to be very interesting on private networks.
Thanks, Vinay.
Basically, Vinay already mentioned most of the things that I also wanted to bring up. I think we are very aligned here, right? So, of course, it's not new, but what is new is that it's 5G with all these new applications in the different verticals, and also the regulatory changes are, of course, an important aspect that make a difference as well. At the same time, Stefan, you're also right. So we are not there yet, right? So I would fully, even without knowing the detailed numbers, right? But from my own experience and the discussions that I have, we are doing many POCs, but if you look, for example, in manufacturing or in other areas, how many factories are really running on 5G in the sense that it's used for the live production, that it's only very few, if any at all. But I think that's just a matter of time, because what we have today is release 15, and release 15, I mean, it's about mobile broadband, right? And here the value add compared to Wi-Fi, if you take this as a benchmark, is simply not high enough, not convincing enough so that you really make the step and replace or extend your Wi-Fi network with 5G network. Where we see it already, I think, is in domains like mining or ports or so, but this is because their coverage is the main issue. And of course, with a private 5G network, you can have a much better coverage and easier than with Wi-Fi, for example. But I agree with Vinay, so once we have release 16 and release 17 chipsets available, especially, with time-sensitive networking, with low latency, high reliability. So then it's getting more and more attractive, and it will be much easier then for the verticals to come up with a positive return on invest, and this is the only thing that matters at the end. So I think it's really a matter of time, and the chipsets alone, of course, are also not sufficient. Then we need an ecosystem of devices and so on. So, and these things, simply take some time. So I would assume we still have to wait 1 to 3 years until we really see then the ramp up of the market, so that it's getting much more than the 1 to 3% that you mentioned, Stefan, if I remember right.
Very good.
If I can go next. So we are on a mission to build a 5G network in every farm in America. There's 2.3 million farms, and our goal is, if we can create that kind of digital infrastructure, that will truly transform farming operations into a digital enterprise. And we need to do that because of all the food crisis we are already seeing now, and it's only going to get worse over time. And the biggest challenge we see is the gap between where we are in the wireless network ecosystem and the application ecosystem, specifically with 5G networks and Open RAN. The application developers have always stayed kind of in a different paradigm from the 5G network itself. There is a very loose coupling of a network and an application. But whereas when you talk about automation, when you talk about using 5G network for any kind of use case, it's a deeply integrated solution. The application has to be completely aware of the network, and the network has to be completely aware of the application. And that's the gap we have to solve. We have to abstract the complexities of the 5G network, everything from slicing to latency management to bandwidth allocation and the noise and all that, and simplify it for application developers to develop apps for 5G. And another way, also Open RAN gives us the flexibility to become more aware of of the application itself and where the application has to reside from the edge of the network to the cloud. So you give the flexibility to the application to match the use case and the problem they are trying to solve. That's the gap we see, and that's the biggest challenge we have to overcome. And the way we are doing it is by creating living labs. We create real 5G networks and farms and work with partners to run applications, bring their applications there, from everything from robotic devices for disease detection, weed detection, and real-time drone imagery processing. So you can then get those apps hardened and developed and ready for the market. And that's an evolution. It's a hard work. It's bringing together a lot of ecosystem partners, especially from the application developers, developers that have developed very good applications natively for the cloud, have to now adapt to developing for the edge, developing for 5G networks, and that's what we are focused on now.
Thanks, Venki.
So if we then look at this topic from the perspective of basically test measurement and assurance and so on, all of the points that's been raised is sort of valid. There's a couple of things to consider, and it is that very few people on the business side of these enterprises wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm going to buy a 5G network. It's going to be a private network. It needs to be 5G. And I actually don't think R15 is right. I need an R16 release or R17 release. And they go out and buy that from a business perspective. Very few people do that. But instead, people say, I have to digitize my business. I have to transform this. I have to achieve this. And then that leads to a set of requirements. Those requirements leads to a set of evaluation of technologies. And you have certain business requirements on that you, for example, might need. You're not going to go for single sourcing on critical infrastructure components, et cetera, et cetera. So this leads you down to a certain set of requirements, and then you start to see how can I fulfill these things. And I think what Andreas outlined on the Bosch side and running all of these POCs, et cetera, that brings knowledge. That knowledge brings you the capability to make informed choices. And when you can make informed choices, you can drive the right business decisions. So at the end of the day, if the organizations have the digitization projects ready, then they are able to take these other steps. But if you don't know what you're going to do or why you're doing something, then you either need to have a good, call it, play budget for whatever skunk works you're doing, or you need to have some other vision of where you want to be tomorrow and where this is involved. And I think that these things are where you will start to see when will this become a major money spend. It needs to be when people run these digitization projects and move them onto workloads that have to be over some sort of wireless connectivity, where only 5G could be the right choice of that technology. Until then, there's obviously going to be a set of competition from Wi-Fi or IoT technologies, etc. And I mean, some of those technologies are good enough for the use cases they are thrown at.
Very good. Thank you. I think that was a good background for the audience here to make sure that we're all on the same wavelength. And we've kind of touched on if we try to figure out the problem statement here to get to that bigger market and to actually cross the chasm. We touched on release 16, release 17. Obviously, we need more spectrum availability. We talked about automation awareness. And is there anything else there that we need to address that you think that we didn't talk about?
Let me add one more thing, just Stefan. So, if you're an enterprise and you're known and your sourcing department know how to source enterprise things, then if you go to one of the traditional telco suppliers and say, I want to buy whatever, a handful of base stations, and they are used to selling tens of thousands of base stations to a single customer, you're not going to end up in a sort of very positive treatment. And an RFQ or a response, etc., you may get very challenging responses to deal with. Which means that the existence of mediators in that ecosystem, people who are system integrators or similar, that take that burden off you, alternatively new infrastructure suppliers or adopted infrastructure suppliers that is focusing on solving the enterprise problems and creating offers against it is a critical availability. And then it's not enough to have one of them. Most sourcing department needs at least 3 or even a handful of them before they can basically go to sourcing on any such environment. So if you only have one company spearheading this, they may have a big issue in actually getting sales because there is not enough of other alternatives to look for.
Good point. Thanks, Per.
I just can confirm that from my side, right? It's, I mean, one thing that is also still missing and critical is cost, right? So it's still what we see today, still expensive. It's the cost for the equipment, but it's also the total cost of ownership, basically, right? So it's still rather complex to operate a private 5G network, more complex than a Wi-Fi network, but probably doesn't have to be, right? And of course, there are companies working on that to make it simpler. And I think it goes along the lines of what Per said. So the early equipment that we have seen came primarily from the public networks, right? And this equipment has high flexibility with thousands of parameters maybe that you may need for some special cases, and high scalability that you can support thousands and thousands of base stations, but we don't need this for many vertical applications and private networks, right? So therefore, there is certainly a need for tailored solutions, also flexible solutions, but especially also customizable solutions, because verticals are very diverse. Even manufacturing, which is one vertical, is very diverse. No factory is basically like another one, right? And you would like to be able to easily tailor the infrastructure also according to your needs.
Yeah.
But that should not mean that I have to buy everything and then I just make use of those things that really matter. But ideally, I can have a modular system, maybe a software-defined system that I can use for that purpose. And that's exactly where Open RAN comes into play. So that's one of the reasons why we see such a high potential in Open RAN.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree with that. Yeah, we call it configuration driven. So you can tailor the needs for a specific use case rather than having all the bells and whistles of every possible feature available in one set. And Open RAN gives you that flexibility to configure both on the architecture side and also on the feature sets that you need. More software-driven, configuration-driven, just like you do cloud-native applications. I think that's another shift we need in terms of how we look at Open RAN products, rather than just being one size fits all for all kinds of industrial use cases. You need to be able to do a limited set of features that are applicable for a given industry, and then give a lot of configuration software-driven features for customizing it for that specific use case.
I mean, if I sort of conclude the discussion on why Open RAN,
We're moving into that topic now. Why Open RAN?
I'm very happy to hear, and I can, probably agree to all panelists that enterprises, of course, when we are speaking to enterprises, they do believe in open architecture-based approaches, which is instrumental to really drive an ecosystem participation that basically is the only way to unlock the value of 5G to enable digital transformation. I mean, enterprise typically find value in IT and open approach, with cloud native sort of adherence to the design principles that offers flexibility, it offers agility, it offers the multiple deployment options, while eliminating, as I think Andreas or Per, you mentioned, while eliminating the sort of need for a single vendor lock-in. I think that's important. The other thing that, I think you mentioned, Venki, I mean, with an open approach and a cloud native approach, I mean, with network functions being as a containers, you can also run, the network functions and applications on a common hyper-converged infrastructure, which then, of course, should facilitate the sort of end-to-end working in a much more seamless manner, with more, adopting an end-to-end CI/CD approach to both application network functions that should drive the operational costs down, and that should drive the time to market faster. So I'm just summarizing what you all said. I mean, that's the reason why Open RAN is seen as a benefit towards the enterprise market.
And
Maybe
it's
I can just bring.
yeah, go ahead.
Maybe we can just bring in another aspect that we haven't explicitly mentioned yet, but which from our point of view is also really critical and very promising in Open RAN, and that's the RIC, right?
Yeah.
The RIC as a new architectural component. We see that the RIC may play an important role in this tailoring of the network infrastructure according to our needs with the XApps and RApps. Also what Per mentioned before, so maybe there can be then smaller players focusing on these niche markets and niche problems that we as enterprise have. They can just come up with some dedicated XApps and RApps. So maybe for the big players, it would not be attractive enough to just spend any thoughts on this, right? But it's even ourselves. We are seriously considering if we could somehow make use of that so that we don't just sell a use case in the sense of a robot in a factory or so, but maybe the robot can come along with his own XApps and RApps in future, which are optimized to the needs of the use case so that it's then getting more a holistic end-to-end solution. Because the problem is if we sell a component or use case, we don't know what network the customer has, right? And of course, there can be a lot of system integration effort then. That would be one way to deal with it. But if we can influence the network behavior and just sell this along with our use case, then it would be much easier for everyone. So that's why the RIC is a key component. And also maybe another aspect is, we briefly touched on this, of course, the softwareization, the cloud native nature and so on, but that we can then simply run all this on a single platform. So both the application intelligence, which is also moving more and more to the edge cloud, and on the same platform then the Open RAN network. And ideally, we can even build a bridge between it so that we can jointly optimize application and the network management, for example.
Great.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key things here to understand is that a lot of people ask and think about whether Open RAN will lower the cost for basically this equipment to build out an enterprise network. And there's obviously two aspects of cost. It's basically the cost drivers and means of, do we think certain vendors have a unreasonable profit margin? And secondly, do we believe that there are cost elements that is baked into the traditional solutions that can be engineered out? And I believe that with the smart deployment of Open RAN, we can engineer out cost elements. A procurement department can potentially engineer out the sort of high margin that people may make on the equipment. But I think it's more important to look at, can we engineer out some of these cost structures that fundamentally gives us an opportunity to deliver lower cost built up into the network? So Andreas speaks about that. There's an ability for someone like Bosch, who has an expertise in a certain use case, to deploy, for example, an RAP or an XApp that will tailor the network. That will obviously take away a huge amount of cost from a traditional vendor or RAN vendor to optimize their radio access against any specific applications. But it then begs the question, is Bosch or Bosch alternatives suitable to write those RAPs and XApps? Maybe they are. Maybe that will be, a great way forward, and that can lower the structural cost. But I think we all have to look through this. So it really as well means that we can't take our old traditional sourcing handbook for how do I basically procure a macro network for full and deploy that onto my enterprise procurement. Because then you end up with the same cost structure again, and you have to rethink what you're doing. So if you rethink those things, think smart, think agile on what you need, and then rethink what are the components I can take risk on. Can I take risk on a certain DU software vendor? Potentially I can, because I can swap that out if I'm not happy with it. But I may not be able to take the same level of risk on my millimeter wave massive MIMO RUs, which I basically deploy hardware on. It's not as easy to swap out. So thinking through those things and then applying that into good business judgment.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah.
We're in a very early stage of this Open RAN, right? So if you look at how innovation has been driven by open source, we're kind of just getting started in RAN technologies here. And what has to evolve is taking this open source, Open RAN technologies, underlying technologies, how do you productize it and specialize it for each use cases? And that still has to evolve. We need a RAN specific for a Bosch-like factory environment, a mining-like environment, or open farming applications. You're going to see that evolution has to happen, and that's going to further specialize and productize the RAN product itself into solving those specific problems. And that's what is going to increase application integrations and adoption. And that's going to further drive down the costs there. And we're still early stages of that. And you're seeing that happen in the manufacturing sector, but there's a lot to evolve where you're going to take those RAN products, underlying technologies, and startups and innovators are going to productize that into specific use case driven applications and products for each industrial environments.
I think that's a good segue to go into the Open RAN enterprise status topic here. Obviously, we look at the market, the Open RAN market in general, and we see that it's proliferating rapidly, and momentum is heading in the right direction when it comes to the public macro network. But I'm not when it comes to Open RAN small cells and private Open RAN. Yeah, I'm not sure it's moving as quickly. I'm not sure that has been the focus as much either. So where are we for some of you that are doing this in terms of what do you feel the status is when it comes to the Open RAN readiness for the enterprise?
I mean, I can maybe start here. I mean,
yeah, that's right.
As we have discussed, I mean, I think clearly, I mean, the sort of asks from the enterprise is to really have the ability to cater a network to their specific use, and drive, in that sense, drive the agility, both in terms of how you deploy the network and also in terms of how you actually bring the transparency of the networks so that the enterprises feel more control on sort of building the network, right? And the other aspect is the simplicity. I guess that's a very big ask from the enterprise, because you don't have, unlike in the macro network with the operators, you don't have a 30, 40 years legacy of actually, having the competence and the resources to managing the network. The simplicity and automation becomes an important part. So how we are looking at is basically a more an end-to-end solution, not so much only looking at then the Open RAN component, which is of course very important, but looking from an end-to-end solution of sort of adopting this cloud native architecture and openness from the radio access into the core components, but more importantly, building the orchestration management that drives an end-to-end automation. That's very important, and the simplicity of managing, for instance, zero-touch provisioning of the server functions and also of the radio units. That becomes a very important part of actually of really keeping the seamless ability of seamless management of the network for the enterprises. So that's so I think, I mean, most as Andreas pointed out, I mean, many enterprises are really implementing this. We have actually done this now for over 25 or 30 now around the world. And it's
30
what? Sorry, I missed that. 30 what?
30 Open RAN based private implementation. So it's there. I think the important part is really bringing this end-to-end simplicity of being able to manage the network and able to sort of give the flexibility to cater to a certain use case. That's very important. Unlike in the macro network, which is based on sort of more monolithic way of looking at the architecture and addressing only specific use cases. Here I think you look at basically the flexibility of really adopting the network to adopt to different use cases and different deployment models.
Okay, great.
Let me just add to this. So I think that as of today, you can go to select players and get a solution from them. Yeah. That might be a system integrator that have pre-integrated something and basically comes to market with that. Or it could be a single vendor coming with a fully fledged solution and coming to market with that. If you think you can today go into like a supermarket and say, I'm going to get that RU, I'm going to get that DU, that CU, and I need a RIC. And I need a landscape of R apps and X apps that's going to manage this for me, then it's not ready. But if you need a set of pre-integrated solutions and you are happy that those comes from a small select set of vendors, then you can certainly get those offers. But if you at the same time could write in requirements that all of those solutions should be open and interchangeable at some point in the future, with complete evolution in software only to release 16 to open ORAN release so and so, that's a very different story. But you can certainly get stuff today which are to some extent have an ORAN badge on it or Open RAN badge on it, and being able to fulfill a set of use cases. But don't believe that those things necessarily out of the box will be software upgradable for the next number of years.
Okay, that's
I
great.
would agree with that in general. So from my perspective, we are still at the beginning on the journey of using Open RAN for private networks in enterprises. But at least we are at the beginning already, right? So it's now taking off. People are getting more and more interested. Also at Bosch, we have been looking into this now for a year or so, but now just really ramping market activities. So we're planning, for example, major POC, so a private 5G network based on Open RAN at our research campus in Renningen in Germany. And this will then be very important for us to see, right, if that really works with the XApps and RApps, that we combine this, bundle this with our use cases and to understand how difficult it really is and so on. And of course, we also had many conversations already with different possible vendors. And also that we had to figure out. So many people say, okay, we have something, and of course you can buy Open RAN, but if you look at the details, as Pierre said, right, if you want to have a rig, for example, and not just a rig, but also a radio with the E2 interface implemented in a proper way, so then it's getting more and more challenging. So you can do something, but it's maybe not a full vision yet. And I think there's also still a way to go, maybe on the standardization side. Of course, right, to get to a more harmonized language and interpretation also of the standard. And I think would also be great to see more and more vertical players engaging in standardization in ORAN, for example, and other bodies, because currently it's still like 3GPP was 4 or 5 years ago. So I think there it is changing already, that Bosch and others are also now going to 3GPP. And we should have something similar then for the ORAN specific, Open RAN specific developments. Not necessarily that all verticals now should become a member, but we have to find some way, some form of collaboration, right? So that also the specific needs and constraints and requirements of the vertical players of the enterprises are understood and also addressed in the relevant bodies.
Great, thanks so much. Anything else there? I think we covered that pretty good. There's a couple of questions coming in. I'm looking at the time now here too. We don't have too much time. I wanted to touch on a couple of other topics, but just in terms of deploying then Open RAN in the enterprise, is there, when we look at the macro network, we actually see that there's going to be different phases when it comes to deploying Open RAN. We have kind of the first interface phase right now, and then we have there's going to be multi-network deployments and virtualization, and then RIC and the white boxes. Are we gonna see similar type of gradual inclusion of Open RAN components then in the enterprise, or is it going to be more, or because we're expecting well, depending on the use case segment, but probably more turnkey solutions will be helpful in some cases. Will there be more? Will those phases be more baked into one? Or will it be more gradual, I guess is what I'm wondering, or is it too early to tell at this point?
I can go. Now, from our perspective, we are looking at from the ground up as Open RAN. That's the only way to go for us. Multiple reasons for that, right? So the architectures we are looking for, we need the flexibility to be able to adapt to different kinds of terrain, different kinds of geographies for networks and coverage requirements. So definitely that's one reason to look at completely Open RAN from the ground up. And then the second thing is we look at separating out the edge infrastructure versus the network itself. We look at them as two separate things. The reason being that we have to be multi-tenant to be able to even have a favorable use case, a business case for ourselves. So that's another driver for us to see that how we can disaggregate the network itself from the infrastructure, underlying infrastructure that's required for cloud native network and applications and all that. And then the third thing is the use case itself. That's driving the needs for that. And the more easier it is to integrate for us from the application layer to the network layer, the better. We expect that to be more innovation and adoption.
And that's the other part we haven't really had time to touch on, but I mean, the term private 5G is rather broad, of course, and you can segment the private wireless market into various use cases. If you look at the performance requirements, or the coverage requirements, or the type of enterprise, and are there some use cases here more so than others where Open RAN might make more sense? I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't forget that Open RAN is not a technology. It's an implementation of a 3GPP standards that enables full interoperability. I mean, through open interfaces and complete disaggregation of software from the hardware, which of course opens up the potential to really adapt the network to specific enterprises for specific needs. I mean, there's questions on what kind of RAN split architecture is good for enterprises. I mean, it basically depends again from enterprise to enterprise. I mean, we've spoken to large enterprises that are looking at 7.2 option on the RAN split as a good split because it minimizes the impact on the transport bandwidth while sort of managing the virtualization on the central unit. That way, sort of enabling a low-cost DU design for wide deployment and adoption. While as in some other cases where the enterprise, where the requirement is simpler, it's MBB driven, it's I mean mostly catered to small to medium enterprises, split 2 option. I mean, then can be a preferred option in terms of deployment model on the RAN split, which then of course is less aggressive on the front haul requirement and it decreases the complexity on the front haul. Yeah, because then you bring in the physical layer and the MAC and the RLC layer integrated into RU, and then the RU DU is what you have on the premise, and the CU is then central unit is on the cloud. So I think the Open RAN as a concept basically brings that ability to really cater and evolve to different use cases for enterprise needs. And I think this will be a gradual evolution as we move on, because there are some challenges, as we all sort of have figured out, challenges on the device side, challenges on the interoperability side, challenges on basically, and I see this as being more and more sort of evolving into different types of requirements that we see and catering to different requirements from different enterprises and verticals.
Great, thank you. I think I'm getting the ping, so we're up on time. So I want to thank the panel for all the inputs. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We didn't get to everything and all the questions here. We'll see if we can answer some of the questions via emails, but we've covered a lot of ground in terms of where we are and some of the challenges to cross that chasm and why Open RAN can actually help to bridge that gap. So I think that was great, great discussion. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to hand back to Sean and Manoon to go forward. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. It was a great session.
Thank you.
Yeah, very much.
Thank you.